think I met Father Jerome Day for the first time last year in New Orleans. He is, but possibly I'd met him in, I think, 2011, when we had our conference at St. Anselm College in Manchester. Father Day, I'll allow, he can say his title change, but it's going to be on something with Newman and Sanctity and St. Benedict, and no better representative than a Benedictine monk to do this for us. So, Father Jerome, the floor is yours.
Okay. Good morning, everybody. This paper is called Fuga Mundi and Necessitas Ecclesiae, Newman's Assessment of Benedict and His Legacy. Among the many possibilities for inquiry, this 2020 conference affords participants the opportunity to explore Newman's understanding of the unique characteristics of particular saints, among whom he is now numbered. One of the central figures in Catholic experience, and certainly a man whose life, work, and legacy attracted the interest of Newman in the mid-19th century, is St. Benedict Nursia in the 6th century. How could it be otherwise? Benedictines under Augustine of Canterbury renewed Christianity in Britain after the Roman departure. Benedictines impressed the mark of the Church of Rome on their evangelization from Kent and on to the north and west of the country. The organization of the Catholic Church in England was largely affected by monks following Benedict's holy rule. The first sustained attempts at education and the promotion of higher learning were driven by monastic endeavors. The leadership of early Catholic England was largely drawn from the cloister. Newman himself, concerned about the legitimacy of the Church of England, was surrounded by the remains of abbeys, priories, and other monastic houses, ruined or transformed and reused, including parts of his own beloved Oxford University. Finally, during Newman's eventful life, Catholics saw the end of the penal laws, Catholic emancipation in the United Kingdom, and the restoration of a Catholic hierarchy, and the return of Benedictines, establishing new monastic houses in a land that centuries earlier they had helped become Mary's dowry. Two of Newman's most important texts on St. Benedict and his monks are now available in a single volume. The Benedictine Essays, The Mission of St. Benedict and the Benedictine Schools, is volume 2 in the Spirituality of St. John Henry Newman series by Acropolis Scholars, 2019. From these two seminal writings, some observations can be made on the influence of Benedict's achievement on Newman. First, Newman's view of Benedict ratifies his own belief in the life of study as being central to human flourishing. Ever since his Oxford days, Newman insisted on a beautiful setting, a peaceful environment, and a congenial pattern of life to be not merely felicitous, but nearly essential elements in the life of the mind. Newman held this view in the midst of Britain's rapid industrialization and urbanization, and while London dominated the world's largest empire. Second, the Cardinal's assessment of Benedictine life acknowledges tensions, perhaps even seeming contradictions, with the lived experience of Benedictine monasticism when seen in the light of the noble principles of the rule. In examining these so-called contradictions, Newman defends the monastic order and finds his exculpating principle to be necessitas ecclesiae, the necessity or need of the church, one that monks have employed for more than a millennium and a half. Third, the two essays advance a theory of history that provides ample evidence of Newman's own theological and historical standpoint. The nuances Newman allows his theory of history raise interesting, even compelling questions for Catholic men and women in this 21st century as they consider the so-called Benedict option. No reader of the Gospels can leave Newman's essays without recognizing that the so-called contradictions noted by some observers of Benedict's monastic heritage are in fact inherent. In other words, the conflict is not so much contradiction as tension of pulling in different directions within the same response to God himself. Before a Benedictine is a scholar, he is a monk. Before he is a monk, he is a Christian. And before he is a Christian, he is a man. Does not Jesus himself retire to the desert, to the mountains, to his home in Capernaum, to the home in Bethany of Martha, Mary, and Lazarus, to restore himself in prayer, silence, contemplation, and domesticity? Newman begins his essay in the January 1859 issue of Atlantis by likening the Benedictines to troops, perhaps the last remnants of imperial Rome, who retreat to a mountain fastness. They cannot advance. Barbarians swirl below them. They will not surrender in defeat, so they wait. This becomes a controlling metaphor for Newman's assessment of the Benedictine centuries, when the order dominated much ecclesial and intellectual life, not because of aggression, but because Benedict's sons and daughters were essentially the only game in town. Newman's image is apt. Many early monasteries were in the mountains, separate from the chaos below, close enough to civilization or to what passed for it, and isolated enough for creation of an environment of peace, prayer, and penitence. This was the classic fuga mundi, flight from the world, advocated by St. Anthony of the Desert and the earliest Egyptian, Palestinian, and Syrian monks. Having left the world, however, Benedict was faced with the challenge of occupying the monastic day. Certainly there would be prayer, common and private, periodically the Eucharist, daily manual labor, agriculture and herding, common meals, and recreation. But within this fundamental system, Benedict endorses reading and study, especially during Lent, particularly of sacred scripture and the fathers of the church, as well as instruction of youngsters under monastic care. In opening the door to study, even in the restricted sense of the Holy Rule, he permits at least three developments. Monks become learned in the biblical text and patristic heritage, something foundational to their vocation. As they teach others from their own or neighboring monasteries, the monastic school begins to emerge. Growing familiarity with classical texts in Greek and Latin invite the curious and daring to read from this secular heritage and to discover significant areas of thematic compatibility and rational discourse. Times grow to include enjoyment of and relaxation with Virgil, Horace, Cicero, Suetonius, Martial, Seneca, Terence, Sallust, Pliny, and others. The scriptorium emerges as a center for a combination of intellectual activity and manual arts. Through the making of vellum, ink, and related materials, bookbinding, cover making, illumination, bejeweling, and other decorative arts, the scriptorium became a place of genuine laborum ex manu, with an important role in an abbey's economic and intellectual life. Newman aims to show how singularly, after all, these employments as carried on were in keeping with the main idea of monastic rules, even though they seem at first sight scarcely contained in its letter. Later on, Newman explores the rise and development of the great Benedictine schools of the early Middle Ages, arguing that the rise and extension of these schools seems to me as great an event in the history of the order as the introduction of the sacerdotal office into the number of its functions. As early as St. Jerome in the 5th century, monks imbibed in secular or profane literature, primarily the classics, and in due course, the pattern of bolstering scriptural and patristic knowledge with classical insight or enjoying a respite from the theology was set. By the time of Theodore of Canterbury, Newman observes the place of such learning, though occasionally challenged, became an actual tradition in Benedictine houses and consecrated a system of authority. With Theodore, Benedictine schools featuring Latin and Greek and the curriculum of the 7 sciences began to proliferate. From Theodore proceeded Egbert and the School of York. From Egbert came Bede and the School of Jerome. From Bede, Alcuin and the schools of Charlemagne in Paris, Tours, and Lyon. From these came Rabban and the School of Fulda. From Rabban, Walafrid and the School of Reichenau. Lupus and the School of Ferrières. From Lupus, Heinrich, Remy and the School of Rheims. From Remy, Odo of Cluny. From the dependencies of Cluny, the celebrated Gerbert, afterwards Pope Sylvester II, and Abbot of Fleury, whom I have already introduced, and the schools of Ramsey Abbey and the inroads of the Danes. Newman provides a roster of Benedictine intellectual achievement amid difficult circumstances that is biblical in scope and style. The Old Testament physical begettings were not superior to these Benedictine metaphorical birthings. This range of education, rooted in scripture and grammar as understood in those centuries, bears an uncanny resemblance to the early 19th century Oxford ideal, so defended by Newman in The Idea of a University. Newman admits as much when he describes the loyalty of the monks to their classical acquirements. It is impossible indeed to overlook their resemblance generally to the elegant scholar of the day, which is now waning, especially at Oxford, such as Louth or Elmsley, Copleston or Keble, Howley or Parr, who thought little of science or philosophy by the side of the authors of Greece and Rome. nor is it too much to say that the colleges and the English universities may be considered, in matter of fact, to be the lineal descendants or heirs of the Benedictine schools of Charlemagne. Newman makes clear his pique at secular writers who acknowledge begrudgingly the depth of monastic learning in the Dark Ages. Whatever the monks had not, a familiar knowledge and a real love were but in keeping with the genius and character of their institute. For they instinctively recognized in the graceful simplicity of Virgil of Horace, in his dislike of the great world of political contest and ostentatious splendor, in his unambitious temper and his love of the country, an analogous gift to that of religious repose, that distaste for controversy, an innocent cheerfulness, which were the special legacy of Saint Benedict and his children, adding that the authors appealed to the classical temperament of the Benedictines, for they found in them the prophets of the human race in its natural condition. If the Benedictine instinct, born of divine charism, is to be alone with the Lord, then the desire for mountain or desert is real. Such departure nourishes in those who embrace monasticism a grace of character that is ideally transportable regardless of circumstance. Newman paints perhaps a romanticized picture of the monk, but it is a powerful defense of the fundamental monastic charism. The one object immediate as well as ultimate of Benedictine life, as history presents it to us, was to live in purity and to die in peace. The monk proposed to himself no great or systematic work beyond that of saving his soul. What he did more than this was the accident of the hour. The spontaneous acts of piety, the sparks of mercy or beneficence struck off in the heat, as it were, of his solemn religious toil, done and over almost as soon as they began to be. If today he cut down a tree or relieved the famished or visited the sick or taught the ignorant or transcribed a page of scripture, this was a good in itself, though nothing was added to it tomorrow. He cared little for knowledge, even theological, or for success, even though it was religious. It is the character of such a man to be contented, resigned, and patient, and incurious, to create or originate nothing, to live by tradition. He does not analyze, he marvels. His intellect attempts no comprehension of this multiform world, but on the contrary, he is hemmed in and shut up within it. It recognizes but one cause in nature and in human affairs, and that is the first and supreme. And why things happen day by day in this way and not in that, it refers immediately to his will. It loves the country because it is his work, but man made the town, and he and his works are evil. Newman sees this as the poetical nature of the monastic order, and it is a poetry rooted in rhythms and cadences of awe that still lace their way through the lives of monks and nuns. Continuing cultural and political disruption interfered with the monastic ideal as presented in the rule, admits Newman, but he also insists that one of the more curious interruptions in the life of individuals and communities came from the church herself, where there was authority for the act and where nothing would be done except on religious principles and religious purposes. He explains, according to the maximum sacramenta propter homines, she has never hesitated to consider, in this sense of the maxim, that the end justifies the means. And since regulars of whatever sort are her own creation, she can, of course, alter, adapt, or change, or bring to naught, according to her needs require, the institutions which she has created. Necessity has no law, and charity has no reserves, and she has acted accordingly. She brought the Benedictine from his cloister into the political world, but as far as she did so, let it be observed, it was her act and not his. Newman is quick to add that this change proceeds not from Benedictine tradition or desire and cannot be fairly represented as a type of work or modification of ideals proper to and sustained by Benedict's disciples. Newman provides an engaging catalog of monks taken from their cloisters and thrust into the ecclesiastical world of authority, controversy, and responsibility. From Gregory the Great and Augustine of Canterbury, there follows, for example, a long line of the Catholic archbishops of Canterbury who were monks down to the 12th century. This process was replicated throughout Europe during the Benedictine centuries, yet for all the concerns it raised for individual monks and their communities, Newman argues that the vast number of monks, perhaps as many as 4 million throughout Europe, and the decentralized structure preserved the ideal over a wide area for a long time. In the beginning of the 14th century, a census of the Benedictines was taken by Pope John the 22nd, according to which the order, from its commencement up to that time, had had 22,000 archbishops and bishops, and of saints alone 40,000. Vague calculations or statements are sufficient to represent general truths. It is difficult to determine what is the percentage of heroic virtue in a population of regulars. If we say at random as many saints as 1 in 100, even at this rate, the number of Benedictines would reach 4 million, and the episcopal portion would only be 180th part of the whole order. Whatever one thinks of Newman's calculations, it is clear that the greater number of monastics adhered to the ancient ideal, even if some of their brothers were summoned to public purpose by and for the church. Interestingly, to this speaker at least, his own community has provided 1 bishop, 1 Catholic school superintendent, 1 judicial vicar for a neighboring archdiocese, several pastors for the parish confided to its care, and a procession of professors, staff members, and administrators for its college just in recent years. No scientific data on heroic sanctity in the aforementioned community, however, is available at this point, but you can use your own judgment as you listen to me. Happily, Newman acknowledges something edifying in the monastic world. These very men who, in one way or another, were engaged in work which St. Benedict has not recognized by name, are themselves specimens of fidelity to their founder and impress the Benedictine type of sanctity upon their literary or political undertakings. Neither the functions of an apostle nor of a schoolmaster are much akin to those of a monk. Nevertheless, in a given individual, they may be reconciled or the one merged in the other. The Benedictine missionary soon relapsed into the laborious husbandman. The champion of the faith flung his adversary and went back to his plow or his pen. The bishop, like Peter Damian, effected, or like Boniface, contemplated a return to, in his old age, to the cloister which he had once left. Newman situates his exploration of Benedict's educational legacy within a theory of history that is developmental, even evolutionary, if one uses the term cautiously. The cardinal saint hardly denies sequential and systemic change, but change for him does not destroy or repudiate what was legitimate before the present moment. His own self-understanding and his approach to the development of Catholic doctrine holds firmly to truth as it moves through tradition. The depth of understanding and the mode of articulation develop over time, but the same truth is visible. Indeed, as Newman argues, the Church herself exhibits this pattern of development in her lived experience. During the Dark Ages into the Middle Ages, Benedictines dominated the public, ecclesial, and intellectual landscape, but they did not suddenly stop. The emergence of the second phase of history, ecclesiastically and spiritually considered, saw the Dominican ethos and the rise of scholasticism. This heavily syllogistic approach to knowledge, having begun in the monastic cloister, continued even as the arguments of the Questiones Disputates moved into the aula maxima. Indeed, a Benedictine taught at the University of Paris at the same time as Thomas Aquinas and Bonaventure. But scholasticism's approach and style were far from the scriptural and patristic nature of monastic learning, and yet it could not proceed without these roots. This same pattern of development is to be seen in the third phase, which he terms Ignatian after St. Ignatius Loyola and his Jesuit disciples. This phase is practical for Newman in that its chief aim is instrumental. Any and all resources that can defend and advance the faith are proper resources in a time of revolt, rebellion, revolution, heresy, schism, exploration, colonization, imperialism, and international warfare. Indeed, the hurly-burly of a world in chaos, now no less than at the fall of Rome, desperately requires oases of peace, islands of reflection, mountain keeps of prayer and study, so that the human spirit can be safeguarded, healed, and renewed. Newman explains the Church did not lose Benedict by finding Dominic, and she still has both Benedict and Dominic at home, though she has become the mother of Ignatius. Imagination, science, prudence are all good, and she has them all. Things incompatible in nature coexist in her. Her prose is poetical on the one hand and philosophical on the other. There are 3 religious orders in these periods, respectively, which precede one the other on its public stage and represent the teaching given by the Catholic Church during the time of their ascendancy. Now, St. Benedict has had the training of the ancient intellect, Dominic of the medieval, Ignatius of the modern, according to Newman, writing in the January issue of Atlantis in 1858. Benedict, who early on entered into the service of the Lord, is assigned for his discriminating badge the element of poetry, whereas Dominic has the scientific element in the sense of logically coherent propositions, and Ignatius has the practical in the sense of knowledge and use of worldly insights and perspectives. Benedict's poetic sense, infused with romance and simplicity according to Newman, far from being narrow, is broad and deep, and not only admits change and variation, but welcomes it. His rule allows it. Development in Benedictine houses occurs because it grew out of him, not the act of strangers who were his rivals, but of his own children, who did but make a new beginning in all devotion and loyalty to him. From Benedict's own hand, the rule come the Cluniacs, Camaldolese, Vallambrosians, Cistercians, Silvestrines, Celestines, Olivetans, Humilati, Gibertines, Oblates, Maurists, down to the Trappists. Benedict's principle of adaptation for the common good is framed by his understanding that in every place we are servants of one Lord and soldiers of one King. If Newman has a somewhat romanticized view of the monk in history, it is because he sees exceptional value in monastic life for the good of the individual soul and as witness of the principle of the mountain and desert in the life of the church. It will be worth the effort to examine some of the specific provisions Benedict's rule for monasteries makes to adapt his structures and even permit intrusions into the life of the cloister. They are not only anticipated and acknowledged, but to some extent welcomed. In RB2, Benedict describes Cenobites as the type of monks his rule is designed to guide. Such men live in community under a rule and an abbot. Benedict is under no illusion that monastic life produced saints immediately. He acknowledges that they too must grapple single-handed with the vices of body and mind, implying that such struggle is somewhat easier in a collective monastery. Those who are elected abbot must use their power and position with strength and gentleness, acknowledging the differences in temperaments among their monks. Such an abbot must lead his community with zeal, recognizing that if faced with a restive and disobedient flock, he must always be striving to cure their unhealthy ways. While the monk is forbidden to do his own will, it can happen that he is called by the church, as Newman represents, to serve in a public ecclesiastical forum. Because a monk is called in obedience to the Roman pontiff, the abbot of abbots, the fourth step of humility is apt advice for those summoned to university teaching, pastoral ministry, or episcopal leadership. In this obedience, under difficult, unfavorable, or even unjust conditions, his heart quietly embraces suffering and endures it without weakening or seeking escape. Once the pattern of seeking monks as church leaders was established, another injunction of the rule took on new meaning. A monk does only what is endorsed by the common rule of the monastery and the example of his superiors. St. Benedict allows adaptations for the amount of food and drink, kind and degree of work, prayer and liturgical practice, discipline, reconciliation, excommunication, care of the sick, travel, attire, and administration. And he surely understands that Christ's call may come from outside his monasteries. His discussion of guests is instructive. Benedict writes, all guests who present themselves are to be welcomed as Christ, for he himself will say, I was a stranger and you welcomed me. Proper honor must be shown to all, especially to those who share our faith and to pilgrims. Benedict discusses the admission of priests and other monks, as well as the offering of sons from the nobility and poor, as well as the departure of members from the community. So it is clear he knows monastic doors swing in both directions, in and out. In RB 64, the possibility of the local bishop, neighboring abbots, or even the Christian laity intervening in the election of an evil abbot is endorsed. This is a striking recognition that monasteries are not and are not meant to be wholly distant from the church and her authorities or members. The same kind of involvement expressed negatively is present in the rule's treatment of the selection of a prior. Finally, in discussing the porter, Benedict writes, as soon as anyone knocks or a poor man calls out, he replies, thanks be to God, or your blessing, please. Then, with all the gentleness that comes from the fear of God, he provides a prompt answer with the warmth of love. Clearly, St. Benedict's monasteries are distinct elements from the wider church, but he provides more than a few openings to permit the church to draw upon these oases of faith, learning, and zeal. And as Newman makes clear, the church did. To conclude with the 21st century's engagement with St. Benedict, the so-called Benedict option should address both Newman's assessment of the legacy of St. Benedict and provisions within the rule itself that authorize engagement with the world. In his 2017 book, The Benedict Option, author Rob Dreher details the idea of individuals who have relocated their residence, work, and personal lives away from secular urban and suburban centers in order to engage with monastic or faith communities, usually in the country. People do this to insulate themselves from the world. Such communities recall the villages that grew up around the ancient monasteries Newman studied. Contemporary mass and social media make complete isolation difficult and not altogether desirable. The coronavirus pandemic, for example, shows need for communicating healthcare guidelines and telehealth links to medical facilities for all the population, even if it occasions political rhetoric that is alternately foolish, fascist, xenophobic, or conspiratorial. Dreher himself has declared that his views include a Benedict option within the world, but with concerted, determined attention on Christian lifestyle, Catholic formation, and liturgical worship with like-minded others. He admits that he lives in the world. Given the needs of the church in a culture increasingly hostile to Catholic values, it is likely that these neo-Benedictine quasi-monastic enclaves will be asked to provide missionaries of some sort to evangelize once again. Where? In the world. Sharp declines in mass attendance, weak religious formation, family dysfunction and collapse, prevailing gender ideologies in marriage, behavior, identification and transition, clergy scandals, manpower declines, abortion, euthanasia, and other life issues, episcopal leadership, political alienation, and other problems both within and without the church give the Benedict option increasing appeal among a minority serious about Catholic identity, values, and lifestyle. Newman's assessment of St. Benedict and his legacy becomes increasingly relevant. The demands and needs of the church do not trump the charisms of the Holy Spirit, of course, but they do shape and influence them, for of course the Spirit breathes life into the church and is the giver of any charism. Newman's Benedictine essays remind Catholics of the 21st century that they should expect to find the same tensions pulling them in diverse directions no less now than the Oratorian cardinal found in his time, no less now than the Benedictine centuries he describes. His words give perspective and hope. The old order of things died, sure enough, Newman writes, but then a new order took its place, and they themselves, by no will or expectation of their own, were in no small measure its very life. The lonely Benedictine rose from his knees and found himself in a city. This was the case not merely here or there, but everywhere. Europe was new mapped, and the monks were the principle of mapping. They had grown into large communities, into abbeys, into corporations with civil privileges, into landholders with tenants, serfs, and baronial neighbors. They had become centers of population, the schools of the most cherished truths, the shrines of the most sacred confidences. They found themselves priests, rulers, legislators, feudal lords, royal counselors, missionary preachers, controversialists, and they comprehended that unless they fled anew from the face of man, as St. Anthony in the beginning, they must bid farewell to the hope of leading St. Anthony's life. Yet he adds, the monastic bodies were not unwilling to come to a compromise with the age and reserving their fidelity to St. Benedict to undertake those functions to which both the world and the church called them. And thus, gentlemen and ladies, are the words of today's paper. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Father Jerome. Your list of what's wrong with the world is one for the ages. I'm just going to record that down. It was absolutely copious and fantastic. It was also just wonderful to hear your. I've always wanted to know, to have a Benedictine reading of Newman's take on Benedict, and so I just found this illuminating. I can't wait to watch the video again. I think there are some really great points to be made. So with that, let's, if you do have the ability to go onto your Zoom kind of window and go to gallery view, we can see everybody. If you would like to offer a question, we have about 17 minutes with Father Jerome and would love to host some questions for him. Just before you speak, unmute yourself and then speak. That's the only rule we have. Any takers? No one wants to take on a Benedictine. I understand it's too early in the morning.
I'll do it.
There we go, Brian. Great.
I'm always calling on my students, so I'll call on myself. That was a lot, Jerome. Thank you so much. That really was a lot in a very condensed amount of time in my mind.
I was afraid that you had passed out for a moment, Brian, but it's all right.
No, not yet, not yet. Your title is Newman's Use of Benedict for the Idea of a Saint.
That was the old title, but yeah, that was.
What's the new? Oh, what's the new title? I'm sorry.
The new title, which I gave maybe too quickly at the beginning, is Fuga Mundi, Flight from the World, and Necessitas Ecclesiae, the necessity or need of the Church, Newman's assessment of Benedict and his legacy.
I see, okay.
But because I am a Benedictine and poetic in my sensibility, according to Cardinal Newman, I'd be happy to answer either title. Not necessarily accurately, but go right ahead.
Well, yeah, I tuned in particular for the old title because
Okay.
I have been interested in Newman's work on the saints. But I mean, what do you read in Newman's review of the Benedictine idea, the Benedictine charism, as essential for holiness? As really, what do you see him appropriating from Benedict in the oratory? Or did you
Well,
look at
I would caution that I'm not, I'm not by any stretch of the imagination a deep Newman scholar, but to the limited extent I know, I think the oratory and the monastery, in fact, in some respects, the oratory by its very name and structure is meant to be a monastery within the communitas, within the city, so to speak. And so that the members are called upon to preserve a certain amount of time and space for quiet, for contemplation, for prayer, and for community, for developing the bonds of fraternity between or among themselves. So that, I think, despite all of the defense that Newman makes against critics of his own age who, gave grudging acknowledgement to the Benedictines for being learned, even in the so-called Dark Ages, I think that's a kind of a sine qua non. And I think if you look at any saint who has been proclaimed by the Church, let's say in the last 30 years, you will see that every one of them, no matter how active, Mother Teresa of Calcutta, perfect example of that, was a woman who insisted upon time for private prayer and time for community prayer, separate from the streets of whatever city her sisters were serving. So that's one. Then, of course, in Benedict's time, and you don't find it actually in the rule as such, there's not a lot of discussion of participation in the Eucharist because it wasn't as readily available. And then as more monks were ordained, the Eucharist became present every day and in a sense constantly as the stipends were received. That's a whole controversial area, but the Mass was going on constantly. But for the community Mass, the conventual Mass, the Eucharist is a huge part of it. And as St. Benedict makes clear, the charity that is displayed among the members of the community to each other and to every single person who comes to the door. That person may be a consummate pain in the neck. He might be a barbarian. He might be intent on the destruction of the monastery. And, once you get that idea, you can close the doors. But you have to receive him first as Christ. And the famous story from the dialogues of the life of Saint Benedict by Pope Gregory the Great, tells the story of King Totila, one of the Gothic kings who shows up. And Totila, I don't know if you know the story, but Totila is disguised as a retainer to somebody else who is disguised as the king. And the Gregory's account makes it very clear that in short order, Benedict pivots and addresses the retainer and recognizes who the king is. But he receives him still gently, with charity, and so on.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Why didn't Newman become a Benedictine?
This is a very good question. I think perhaps his application got lost in some failure of the Royal Mail. I don't know the answer to that. But the Benedictines were just really getting themselves established in the middle of the 19th century in England. There were Benedictine abbeys, as you know, everywhere in England and throughout the British Isles. But it took a while. So I don't know that. But he certainly, to me, displays in many respects a Benedictine sensibility.
Did the Oratorians perhaps give him more freedom to do his writing and other things that he did?
Well, some of the that is a possibility. Although some of those monasteries then and now provide great opportunity for research and writing. I do think Newman had a great desire to see his work published and become part of the conversation, as we use that term nowadays. And that was not always possible. Benedictines in the 19th century did a lot of research and a lot of writing, but not all of it was published as such.
Or did he want to be able to do pastoral care?
Well, he did do pastoral care, and again, that too is something that I find hard not to imagine as a Benedictine thing, because I've been doing it for 20 years. But many of my confreres just up the hill are engaged in much more focused academic work, and they do ministry, but it's much more limited. So those are things proper to Cardinal Newman's own biography. I do believe that when the Newman Association had its conference at St. Anselm about 10 years ago or so, one of my confreres, Father John Fortin, delivered a paper on these very essays, and which unfortunately is not extant, so I was not able to consult it. But one of the things he was telling me was that he found it intriguing that Benedict was so laudatory of Benedictine achievements and the rule, and yet had never actually visited a Benedictine monastery. I don't know whether that's true or not. When you next meet Father Ian Kerr, maybe you can get a sense of that. He probably has far better knowledge of that than I do.
Dave, isn't it Beaumont that's giving the plenary?
Yeah, he is.
He might know also.
He might.
Yep.
I might be able to say a word to the question too. At least two reasons why he didn't become Benedictine or join another monastic order like that. One was he was very aware that he would be converting and entering the Catholic Church as a group with a lot of his friends who had been Anglicans and with Tractarian leanings. So he wanted something that wouldn't be too burdensome in terms of renunciation for everybody to get on board with. You know, he was with educated gentlemen, and you know, they were used to certain conveniences of life. So that was one reason why he was more drawn toward the oratory. Another one was Newman wanted to make sure whenever he entered into his new life as a Catholic that he retained his name of John Henry Newman and wouldn't be taking on a different name. He wanted the continuity of his life as he continued to publish and work to be evident on the surface for his readers and his audience. So those are a couple of the reasons why he had been, I think, thinking for a time about joining the Redemptorists or the Passionists. Those I think were foremost on his mind. But those are a couple of the considerations that I know he thought about when it came to, well, sort of what community would he be a part of.
I would add, yeah, I would add to that. Didn't he? I think he had a great craving for stability, and you can find that in the Benedictines. But one of the challenges in monastic life is the vow of obedience. As we understand it, it's part of Conversatio Morum, and it is. Most people are conscious of the renunciations, but the greatest renunciation is the renunciation of your own will. And I can tell you that remains a challenge for most of us until we go through the dream of Gerontius and engage the face of God. And we probably have a little purgation to do over that, because that is the thing that is dear. Many people think possessions or family life, sexual encounter, all of those things are the hardest things to give up. But for most monks that I talk to who have been around for a while, it is that submission of the will to the rule, to the need of the community, to the needs of the church. And also the community corrections, if you want to call it that.
I would also add one of Newman's reasons for the oratory over the Benedictines was the oratory allowed him to continue the way his life had been. It would be not a dramatic break from the past. He was able to, and him and his followers was able to continue to live as they had done at Oxford and Cambridge in that university system. The oratory daily life allowed for that.
Interesting.
Yeah, I was just thinking that. Thanks, Joe.
In addition to that, also, Father Jerome, he as you probably know, he speaks of St. Philip Neri. He was drawn by St. Philip Neri's ideal in his life, and that too, as much as he admired so many other people, that too drew him. Although I do think what Joseph and Adam were saying, the continuity of his freedom and his continuity played a big part in that too also.
Yeah.
I did want to ask you though, can you, because I'd like to read what you said, when you talked about at St. Benedict's openness and adaptation, and is that so much St. Benedict, or is that more the Benedictines as they continue? How much did Benedict foresee that, or did he write about that, or and then you make a point that you're saying that Newman focuses on that. He talks about that.
Yeah, I would say, Father, this with regard to Saint Benedict. One very interesting, and I think in some ways a foundational principle in the rule, which many people the rule rises up kind of in a majestic thing because of its great history and the work that it's done as this very unchanging kind of document that preserves in the church, and in truth that it does that. However, within the rule itself, after St. Benedict provides the liturgical code, there's sort of a code on how you get on with your brothers, how you get on with your abbot, and the virtues that you should have. Humility is part of that. But there's also on how you should sing the Psalms. And it goes on for a number of chapters. And at the end of it, St. Benedict writes that any abbot, any community that can find a better way of achieving the same goal, the praise of God throughout the day, is very welcome to use it. And it introduces a principle of adaptation. Now, you have to adapt you have to adapt the letter according to the spirit of the rule. So you can't adapt yourself outside of the broad parameters of the rule. But I think that principle of adaptation is something that many people, as they have tried to bring the beauty of St. Benedict's approach to Catholic life through the centuries, have relied upon. So I would say that's where you situate, that's where I would situate the changes or the openings that St. Benedict, and the same thing, he doesn't say, you know, when somebody who is an unbeliever or somebody who is a constant thorn in the side, it knocks on the door, slam that door and get yourself a good lock. He says, receive him with Christ and give him as Christ and receive him with a blessing, or ask his blessing. So it's a very, you know, just embedded in the text are those things. The other thing I would want to point out is that it's a kind of a general truism, at least among monastics, that we end up talking about the rule more than St. Benedict, because we don't have really primary sources on the rule of St. Benedict. We do on St. Anselm, many people, we have lots of material on. But the Gregorian life of Benedict is really meant to give a spiritual picture of St. Benedict. And the Pope says in that account that Benedict himself cannot be different from the rule that he produced. So he uses the rule itself in a backward glance to devise a life. I'm not saying it's fictional. I'm sure much of it are stories that were handed down, but its frame and its structure is revealed to you even as you're reading it. So does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. It's funny with regard to Joe Pierce's observation about maintaining the kind of life that Cardinal Newman had. I can remember my novice master quite frequently said to me, you should study Newman. And he said, second of all, remember, the monastery is not an elite club for men. It's not a men's club in the New York or the London sense of that. So I'm not accusing the Cardinal of wanting that. I'm just saying, I find there's some resonances in my own experience with that. What people have to say.
Well, that's wonderful, Father Jerome. It is 9:50, and we want to thank you so much for this presentation, and what a spirited question and answer session. This was great.
Well, thank you, Dave.
We are.
Thank you, everybody.
Yes, absolutely. And so we're going to end the meeting now.